Tonight on Talking Politics, my sit down with Senator Ed Markey on his hometown of Malden, the fate of TikTok, President Biden's decision to approve the Willow oil drilling project in Alaska, and Markey's decades-long fight to make daylight savings time permanent. But first, evictions are on the rise in a big way in Boston, where landlords are filing more than 100 such complaints a week, according to the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. That's up nearly 75% from a year ago. Experts say the problem's been brewing since federal and local pandemic-era eviction moratoriums lapsed a year or so ago. And the situation's only expected to get worse as the last remaining protection of its kind in Massachusetts, a law that requires eviction cases to be paused when tenants have a pending application for rental aid, is set to expire at the end of the month. So what could the government be doing to help keep people in their homes, and what political considerations might keep that from happening? I'm joined now by State Rep Mike Connolly, who sponsored the original COVID-era eviction moratorium here in Massachusetts, and Andrea Park, Director of Community-Driven Advocacy at the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute. Thank you both for being here. Andrea, is the spike in evictions in Boston that I just mentioned part of a broader trend happening across the state?
Thanks, Adam, for having me. And absolutely, it is. I think that statistic you cited about Boston is pretty consistent statewide. Statewide, pre-pandemic, we saw an average of about 40,000 eviction filings per year in the housing and district courts. And last year, we were up to over 32,000. And just comparing the first 2 months of 2022 over the first 2 months of 2023, 2022 saw 4,823, and in January and February of this year, there are over 8,000. So we're on track not only to meet, but to exceed pre-pandemic eviction numbers. And I think one of the questions we should be asking ourselves is, why are we holding that up to be a standard? Why do we think that getting back to that number is an okay thing as a matter of policy? Let's get back to that question in a second. But before I go to Mike, am I correct that these eviction proceedings tend to have an inordinate impact on, or to inordinately represent, obviously lower income people, but also people of color in heavily urban areas? Am I correct about that? That is correct. We have actually published a study looking at evictions that were happening during COVID, and there is a strong correlation between neighborhoods that are majority minority neighborhoods and high incidence of evictions. And that's not true only statewide, but also nationally. This is a statistic that is borne out over and over again, in particular, Black women and single-headed households. Mike Connolly, can you offer a brief recap for anyone who might need it, which probably includes me, of the protections that were implemented during the pandemic and then have faded away? Because there have been a few different pieces put in place, state pieces, federal pieces. Can you just give a quick overview?
Sure. When the pandemic struck, the state legislature, along with the governor and many housing advocates, all took action to pass what was widely considered the strongest eviction and foreclosure moratorium. And it, by all accounts, worked very well. That was in place for about 6 months. Then the legislature passed something called Chapter 257, which is a provision that will stay and continue an eviction process while a tenant is seeking rental assistance. And so that's been a very important but basic level of protection that's been in place, and it's due to expire at the end of this month. When you say strongest protection or strongest provision, you mean in terms of states across the country, Massachusetts is, or was considered the most robust? I think generally it was recognized as one of the strongest. I know the Eviction Lab at Princeton University recognized it as the strongest. Certainly, I think it was effective in the moment, but of course now we see evictions are rising again, and it's very concerning. Andrea, you were one of the lead authors of a letter arguing that Chapter 257 be kept in place, urging policymakers to make a point of continuing that through next year while a search for what you described as a more permanent solution is found. How many people would be helped if Chapter 257 is extended for a year plus? So it's hard to know exact numbers of how many people would be affected one way or the other. I think one data point that might be useful is that since this law went into effect January 1st of 2021, there were over 9,000 continuances that were granted.
as a result of people specifically requesting Chapter 257 protection. And that's only during the case. There's also a provision of Chapter 257 that says even if the mover is on their way to, there's no court case anymore, the mover's on their way to your house, if you have applied for rental assistance, and we've seen this happen, you can go to court and say, wait a second, we could resolve this eviction case. Just give me another week. Maybe the check is in the mail. And those are not actually being tracked. So I think there are a tremendous number of people who are very concerned about what would happen to their cases if this protection goes away.
I want to ask you also, what would a more permanent solution, as you describe it, or I hope I'm getting the phrase generally correct, a permanent solution, how might that look? Which I think in a way gets back to your original point about why are we taking the eviction status quo as it was pre-pandemic or at the beginning of the pandemic as the baseline. What kind of permanent solution would you like to see lawmakers put in place?
There's actually a bill that's been filed this session by Representative San Antonio and Senator Liz Miranda that would make Chapter 257 protections permanent. And so that was the reason in our letter that we requested this to be extended through the legislative session, because we'd like to see that bill passed. I think using our collective energy to prevent evictions is what we should be doing. And this is a really common sense solution. It gets money into landlords' pockets. It prevents a very costly and disruptive eviction when it doesn't need to be happening. And, we learned a lot of valuable lessons during COVID, and we should be careful that we don't throw them all out just because we want COVID to be behind us. And we very strongly and firmly believe that this is one of those protections that really makes a lot of sense. It's win-win across the board.
Mike Connolly, there is other legislation kicking around at the State House which could in some way mitigate or help with the problem of housing insecurity. You've been very vocal on rent control over the years. Can you, again, provide a recap of some of the other bills that are at least under consideration that could help keep people in their homes over the coming years?
Sure. Well, rent control or rent stabilization would absolutely, help stabilize tenancies, help avoid egregious rent hikes or no-fault evictions. Right to counsel is a very important provision. We mentioned earlier that our eviction and foreclosure moratorium was recognized as very successful. Nevertheless, throughout the pandemic, we still saw the disparity of landlords who were represented by counsel and tenants who generally often aren't represented by counsel. Right to counsel is something that not only can help tenants, but you hear from landlords that they would rather deal with a professional who has experience rather than a tenant who's going through crisis. So we need right to counsel. We need eviction ceiling. To the extent someone does get an eviction on their record, that can prevent them from accessing housing in the future. The eviction records can even impact children or family members of someone who may be associated with a lease. So there's a whole range of housing justice policies. And, I completely agree with Andrea that we can't go back to the old normal. We have to appreciate what worked during the pandemic and look to build on it.
Governor Reilly has made it clear over the course of her campaign for governor and since she took office that, at least broadly speaking, she sees access to housing as a problem, a really pressing problem facing the state. Let's take a look at a little snippet of her inaugural address.
The cost of housing is out of control for too many because we simply don't have enough of it. If we want Massachusetts to be a home for all, we need to build more places to live, and we need to make sure those homes are within reach. High housing costs are unacceptable for our people, our businesses, and our state's future. To fix that, we need to think big. We will build a state with room for all of its people.
Mike Connolly, in those bites, to me at least, Governor Reilly seems to be hitting the supply piece of housing policy really hard. I can't tell, watching that speech, if she's on board with the kind of solutions that you've just been running through. What's your sense of how much appetite there is for taking the steps like the ones that you just mentioned on the part of Governor Reilly and also leaders in the House and Senate?
Well, certainly, I think it's a milestone that Governor Reilly did include local rent stabilization in her platform, and she's reiterated her willingness to support cities and towns. Of course, before we can get to the governor's desk, we have to move these proposals through the legislature. So that's really the starting point. And certainly, I think the focus on housing is very welcome and appreciated. And then I think we have to, drill down and where the rubber meets the road, really implement policies that work. When we say we need to build housing, I think we have to be thoughtful about who the we is. And personally, I'm interested in addition to supporting the conventional housing market, developing programs such as a social housing public development program where the state could leverage some of its own financial resources to begin to add to the mix of development in the state.
Really quickly, I want to give Andrea the last word here, but what are the prospects of rent control right now? I read a piece, I think in Axios, Boston, arguing that it doesn't seem like Ron Mariano, the House Speaker, is interested in moving it forward, and in that case, it won't move forward. What's your sense of whether it's still viable?
I think it's quite viable. I think that the work that the Boston City Council did was very impressive. And if you listen to what the real estate industry is saying, they're essentially saying that they think the Mayor Wu's proposal is reasonable, but they don't want to open the door to any kind of rent regulation. Okay. So essentially their position is no compromise, no accommodation. And I think, we as advocates and as legislators have to seek fairness for all concerned. And it's not fair for tenants to have their rent doubled overnight, and it's not fair for people to get thrown out of their apartments.
Andrea Park, just briefly, is there anything, as you work on this issue, is there anything you think policymakers simply don't get when it comes to the human impact of evictions? You've got about 30 seconds.
I think it's that they don't get it. I think that we've gotten used to sort of doing things in different buckets, in different bubbles. And I think, I agree with what Mike is talking about. When it comes to solutions, we need to look at solutions as a whole. So I agree with your assessment that the governor's plans and statements really do focus on supply, but we have to see housing and our housing crisis as a part of a whole, and there are a lot of related pieces to that.
Okay, Andrea Park, Mike Connolly, thank you both for talking this through. Next up, we've had plenty of politicians come join us here in the studio, but in a new segment we're calling In the District, I'm meeting with politicians on their home turf in a spot that is special to them. First up, Senator Ed Markey, who brought us to one of his favorite places in his hometown of Malden.
I believe spring begins not on March 21st. It begins when daylight savings time begins and the Red Sox are in spring training. That's when, in Boston, we start to feel that the winter is over.
Today, I'm catching up with Senator Ed Markey. We're covering TikTok, daylight savings time, the environment. But first, let's start by talking about Malden. Can you start off telling me a little bit about the spot that we're in and its connection to your family?
Yeah, this is the Malden Senior Center, but it's also a youth center. When they were opening it, they asked me if they could name it after my mother and father. My mother grew up here in Malden. She was one of 5 daughters of an immigrant Irish couple. My grandmother died when my mother was 17 and president of the senior class here in Malden. And so she had to raise her younger sisters in Malden. And
you told me she was one of 5? Right?
She was one of 5 girls. So the oldest had to go off to work, and then my mother had to be the mother for the youngest 3 sisters in the family. And so we've been here for a long time. So they are honored, obviously, by having this center named after them. But it's in memory of every single kind of immigrant story here to Malden in terms of making this the great city, which it is. And now it's new immigrants from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, from South America, who are populating the city and making it even greater in the 21st century than it was in the 20th.
What makes Malden distinct from the cities and towns that are right around it?
When I was a boy, Malden had 3 theaters, the Auditorium, the Granada, the Strand. We had a Jordan Marsh, a real department store downtown. We were a center. All the buses came through Malden. We had one of the most beautiful libraries of any city in the United States. We felt special. We are not Boston. We're just north of Boston. And many people just ride through at a high rate of speed. But we have a great sense of pride about our community, what we represent historically. So Malden is part of a collection of small cities because we did not get absorbed back in the late 19th century as part of the expansion of New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago. We would be North Philly, We would be North Chicago, but these communities all said, no, we were part of the American Revolution. We were part of the founding of this country. We are not going to be absorbed. And so these individual histories are very important. And if you come from Malden, you just grow up feeling special. That you're from a place that has a rich history, but an even richer future.
You're making me want to move back with that tribute to your hometown. I want to ask you about what's happening with TikTok, because it looks like the United States may be headed toward banning the use of TikTok over national security concerns involving that Chinese ownership stake and privacy rights. You're kind of a TikTok power user, and I say that as someone who has yet to get comfortable with TikTok. It kind of unsettles and confuses me, but you're on there a lot. You're engaging with constituents, asking about important issues. What's your sense of whether banning TikTok would be a good way to go?
Well, my view about TikTok is that it is, in fact, something that many times is preying upon young people in our country, but no different than American companies as well. So when 1 in 3 teenage girls in the United States last year reported that they contemplated suicide, and much of it is social media related, we need a privacy bill of rights for all children, teenagers in our country. And the big companies have fought me the whole way. And I think this could be finally my opportunity, just to say that the great threat to our country is to the children, it's to the teenagers. So yes, on the one hand, I think that TikTok should be banned from a governmental institutions' use, but in terms of the general use of TikTok or any of these social media sites, it is absolutely critical that we put in place as part of this discussion a privacy bill of rights, not only for teenagers, but for all Americans.
I really like the idea of a privacy bill of rights, in part because I have a couple daughters, one soon to be a teenager, one currently a teenager. But just so I'm clear on this, you don't see an extra threat posed by TikTok because of that Chinese ownership stake and possible privacy
in our society. And I think we should await the conclusion of that study, but I don't think we have to wait to say that this whole discussion about the impact that it's having upon children and the fact that the Chinese don't allow their children to be on TikTok for anything other than informational and educational purposes, and in our country, it's wide open all day long. Well, the same thing is true for every other website, every other social media site in the United States. So I think while we await the conclusive study of the impact on our national security, I think that we should absolutely take this as an opportunity to put a comprehensive privacy bill of rights in place. I'm just sick and tired of the big tech companies in the United States blocking my privacy bill of rights for teenagers in our country. It is a public health crisis.
You've been sharply critical of President Biden's decision to give the go-ahead to the Willow project that'll expand oil drilling in Alaska. Why do you think President Biden made that call?
Well, obviously, I worked very closely with President Biden to pass the IRA, the largest climate bill in the history of any country in the world.
The Inflation Reduction Act.
The Inflation Reduction Act. That was $369 billion just last August. That's unleashing a wind and solar, all-electric vehicle, battery storage technology revolution in our country. The benefits are already palpable. So I was disappointed that the president gave the okay to the Willow project, even in reduced form. My own view is that it's not needed, that we're going to have a world where the oil which we needed in the past is just going to be replaced by electric-driven cars. We're going to have 50% of all new vehicles in the United States will be electric by the year 2030, only 7 years from now. So we put 70% of all the oil we consume into gasoline tanks. The oil industry continues to say, drill, baby, drill, but young people say, plug in, baby, plug in, and that revolution is going to take place. It's unfair to the native communities of Alaska. It sends the wrong signal to the rest of the world. You cannot preach temperance from a bar stool. You can't tell the rest of the world that they should be conserving when we're giving the okay to the oil industry for projects that are not needed. I introduced the Green New Deal with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just 4 years ago, and it created a movement that drove the passage of the IRA, of the huge climate bill last year. And I think that young people will be disappointed if this isn't anything other than a one-off, an exception, because they really do believe that preceding generations have let them down. They've left them with the consequences of unrestrained greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So from my perspective, I'm going to fight hard to make sure that this is it, that he doesn't make any other decisions of this nature, because we're going to need them as a political army in the 2024 election cycle. Donald Trump's coming, MAGA Republicans are coming. We've got a good answer for it. That we're creating millions of jobs, we're reducing greenhouse gases, while at the same time bringing environmental justice to communities like Chelsea and Roxbury and Malden that have long been the places where the polluters felt that they could have their free reign.
Is there anything looming, whether it's regulatory decisions or legislation the president could get behind that would help him, to your eye, get back on the right side of environmental considerations?
Right now at the Environmental Protection Agency, they're in the process of promulgating the regulations for heavy trucks, for all vehicles, for this coming generation. They're also in the process of promulgating the rules and regulations for the utility sector in our country for the coming generation. Both of those decisions and the rules that will be promulgated as a result will set us on a course to meet our highest goals for reducing greenhouse gases and unleashing millions of new union jobs in our country. So I'm working closely with the EPA as the chairman of the Climate Change Subcommittee in the Senate to make sure that those regulations are strong. I met with the head of the EPA last week. I talked to the White House again last week about those regulations, how important it is to make them as strong as is historically possible.
When will we know if the EPA and the White House heed that advice?
We could see the first regulations as soon as the end of April. And I've just asked them to lift their gaze to the constellation of possibilities for our country, for our planet, for the next generation, and to just put aside the concerns which these polluting companies are bringing to the table. It's just time for us to make the historic change we have to make.
I'm curious, you've been in Congress now approaching half a century, right? You started in 1976. My sense has always been that even if government is divided, my sense from the outside, even if government's divided, there's the possibility of bipartisan cooperation on at least some issues. How does that possibility of meaningful bipartisan collaboration right now stack up to other points in your tenure?
Well, obviously in a very polarized atmosphere right now. But even with that said, it's still possible to move to find Republicans who are concerned about the fact that 1/3 of all teenage girls contemplated suicide last year, to pass a comprehensive child online privacy bill. So there I'm working with Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, very conservative Republican, to move towards that legislation. Just in December, I was successful with Republicans, including Roy Blunt from Missouri, to pass $25 million to have the CDC study for the first time the impacts of social media on young people in our country. And I'm going to be working very closely on community health center reauthorization this year as the chairman of the Health Subcommittee in the Senate to see if we can't do something finally about this dramatic shortage that we have in nurses, in doctors, in mental health professionals in our country. We're down 400,000 nurses in our country right now.
That's
and
a
I think,
number.
And much of it would be in rural America, where they're more red state. So my hope is that I'll be able, once again, I have 590 laws on the books signed by presidents, and every time I had to find a Republican, and that's what I'm doing right now, once again, trying to find the Republicans that I can partner with to solve these huge societal issues.
Let me ask you about an issue which may not be quite as big as the ones that you mentioned, but is of intense interest to you, also me and other people whose mood is determined by the amount of light we happen to get on a given day. You're partnering again with Senator Marco Rubio to try to make daylight savings time permanent, right? So that would keep in place the setting of the clocks that we are currently experiencing. Am I getting that right?
That's right.
Okay. Because every year I need to remind myself how daylight savings time works and what it means. What's holding this up? Because to a lot of people, I really like it to be later. I feel like it helps my mood, makes me happier. People around me seem to be happier. What's the holdup here?
Well, the holdup is that even though there aren't many of them, there's enough fans of darkness who still populate the House and Senate to be able to block passage of year-round daylight savings time. But we can already see the benefits of daylight savings time. We're in the second week of it right now. There's an extra hour in the evening. It makes the corners of people's mouths turn upwards with a smile. They can go out for a walk longer, go shopping, begin to play tennis or softball or Little League. And so all of the benefits are obvious, and Marco Rubio and I are going to work as the senators from the Sunshine State and the Bay State, to bring this gift to Americans all across the country. We got it passed in the Senate last year. We're going to continue to work to get it done. I started to work on daylight savings time back when I was the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee. And time has to come under some jurisdiction in Congress, so it comes under the Energy Subcommittee. So I had it. So I moved it over the years from the end of April, the last weekend in April, to the beginning of March. And instead of being 6 months daylight and 6 months standard, it's now 8 months daylight and 4 months standard. So I was able to get that done.
Thanks.
But I won't be finished until we can make it year round. And with Marco, and he and I have partnered before in passing legislation, including on fentanyl detection at our borders that was signed into law, he and I are committed to actually ultimately being successful.
Senator Markey, thank you for the conversation. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for coming over here to the great city of Malden.
It's great to be back. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And in the interim, tell us what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics, or you can find me on Twitter. I'm @Reilly Adam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.